The winds of trade policy are shifting across the Atlantic. In September 2025, talk in Washington of a sweeping 100% tariff on all goods from India and China has rattled European capitals. This isn't a minor policy spat, it's a fundamental split in how the US and EU approach global trade and diplomacy. For the EU, trade is the foundation of its post-war identity and foreign policy, built on economic integration and a rules-based order. Unilateral tariffs are seen as blunt, risky tools that threaten supply chains and global stability. The US, meanwhile, often favors bold, protectionist moves to secure national interests, even at the risk of international friction. While both sides worry about China's trade practices and India's rise, their solutions diverge. The US pushes for immediate action, the EU for patient negotiation and coalition building. European leaders know their prosperity is tied to global supply chains, and a trade war could backfire, harming both economies and diplomacy. The EU's quiet but firm opposition to the tariff plan signals the limits of transatlantic alignment in a multipolar world. To grasp the transatlantic rift, it's crucial to distinguish tariffs from sanctions. Tariffs are taxes on imports, used to protect domestic industries or pressure trade partners, an economic tool governed by WTO rules. Sanctions, by contrast, are foreign policy weapons designed to punish or change behavior over issues like human rights or security. The EU and US often cooperate on sanctions, as with Russia, but their legal philosophies differ. The EU prefers multilateral, UN-backed sanctions and strict WTO compliance on tariffs. The US is more willing to act unilaterally, using national security as justification for tariffs and imposing secondary sanctions that reach beyond its borders. This extraterritorial approach frustrates the EU, which sees it as an infringement on sovereignty. The EU's legalistic, multilateral mindset clashes with America's assertive, go-it-alone style. At the heart of the current tariff debate is this deep difference in legal culture and strategic preference. It's not just about economics. It's about how each side sees its role in the world. The Russia-Ukraine conflict complicates the trade debate with India and China. Western sanctions on Russia, including a price cap on oil, aim to cut Moscow's revenues without spiking global energy prices. But much of Russia's oil now goes to India and China, who haven't joined the sanctions and buy at a discount. If these countries stopped buying Russian oil, global prices would soar, hitting Europe hardest. Imposing massive tariffs on India and China could provoke retaliation, disrupt energy flows, and trigger the very crisis the West wants to avoid. The EU must balance pressure on Russia with energy stability, tolerating India's and China's purchases as a necessary evil. Punitive tariffs would ignore this reality and risk global economic turmoil. The EU's approach is careful risk management, not disruptive gestures. In September 2025, EU officials quietly visited Washington to urge restraint on the proposed 100% tariffs. Armed with economic data, they warned that such tariffs would devastate not just the EU, but the global economy, including the US. European industries, deeply tied to China, would face production halts and soaring costs. The EU argued that a trade war would alienate partners and undermine efforts to address China's rise through coalition building and regulatory power. Targeting India would be especially counterproductive, as the West is courting India as a strategic counterweight to China. The EU's message, avoid public rifts, leverage joint strengths, and use targeted, coordinated actions instead of sweeping tariffs. They proposed WTO cases and joint negotiations to address specific grievances. The outcome of this diplomatic mission could shape the future of transatlantic relations. The stakes are global economic stability and the credibility of Western alliances. Including India in the US tariff plan is a major sticking point for the EU. Brussels sees India as a cornerstone of its 21st century strategy, a democratic partner and a key player in the Indo-Pacific. The EU-India partnership spans climate, digital transformation, and infrastructure, offering an alternative to China's Belt and Road. Slapping huge tariffs on India would undermine this partnership and signal that economic interests trump strategic commitments. The EU is actively deepening ties with India to diversify away from China, encouraging European firms to invest there. Massive tariffs would halt this shift, penalizing European businesses and creating uncertainty. EU diplomats see punitive action against India as short-sighted, risking both economic and geopolitical goals. The aim is to bring India closer to the West, not push it away. Trade disputes should be resolved through negotiation, not unilateral punishment. The tariff debate comes as the EU and India are negotiating a landmark free trade agreement. These talks, relaunched in 2022, are a top EU priority, promising huge opportunities for both sides. A US tariff shock would derail negotiations, souring trust and making concessions politically toxic for India. The collapse of the FTA would be a strategic setback for the EU, losing access to a fast-growing market and weakening its de-risking strategy. The FTA is the EU's best tool to shape its economic relationship with India on its own terms. EU officials are working to insulate talks from US political noise, reaffirming their commitment to rules-based trade. The EU must distance itself from US moves without rupturing the alliance. The prize, a historic trade deal with India, is too valuable to risk for a disruptive tariff policy. For EU diplomats, a 100% tariff plan is a recipe for chaos and unintended consequences. The immediate risk is retaliation. China and India could target key European exports, sparking a trade war. More broadly, such unilateral action would erode the rules-based order the EU has spent decades building. If the US ignores WTO rules, others will follow, leading to a world where might makes right. This would weaken the EU's influence and leave it more vulnerable. A hostile US move could even push India and China into tactical alignment, strengthening an anti-Western bloc. The EU would face a painful choice: join a self-destructive trade war or break with the US. Domestically, a trade war would fuel economic disruption and empower populist movements. The EU's opposition is about economics, foreign policy, and self-preservation. The risks far outweigh any potential gains. The tariff dispute is a stress test for the EU-US alliance, exposing deep differences in strategy and philosophy. The way forward isn't unilateral action, but continuous dialogue and mutual respect. The EU insists that cooperation means partnership, not subordination, and will act based on its own interests and values. The EU's resistance to tariffs is about stability and predictability, not anti-Americanism. The world is watching how the West manages its internal differences. A unified strategic approach can shape global norms. A divided West will cede ground to rivals. The EU calls for patience and smart use of collective power, not economic wrecking balls. The future of the transatlantic partnership depends on bridging this divide and acting as true partners.